Why hello there internet, I'm CST from the Guild of Awesome, and today I'm going to review each game in the incredible Mass Effect Trilogy, and show the changes made for the recently released remaster called the Legendary Edition, which contains all 3 games in the original trilogy, that's Mass Effect 1, 2 and 3, and includes all but one DLC. The missing DLC is Pinnacle Station for Mass Effect 1. It's terrible, so we're not missing much. The Legendary Edition has made a bunch of changes, mostly in Mass Effect 1, but all 3 games now run at 4K at 60 FPS with HDR. If you're just here to see the Legendary Edition stuff, I'll leave some timestamps in the description. I also want to point out that I could not get my 4K setup working, so the footage you'll see for the Legendary Edition is at 1080p. Please bear that in mind when I talk about the graphics and performance. I also played the Legendary Edition on an Xbox One, so other platforms may perform differently. Let's get this journey started. BioWare released Mass Effect 1 for the Xbox 360 in 2007, then ported the game over to PC with some upgrades in 2008, and then it was ported again to the PlayStation 3 in 2012. For your reference, all the footage I'm going to show of the original versions of Mass Effect 1, 2 and 3 are from the Xbox 360 version. On release, the game got a reputation for having a fantastic story, characters and world building, but it's having really buggy and awkward gameplay. We'll get to the gameplay in just a second, but for now, let's get into the story. I won't spoil anything, I'll just give you the premise. Mass Effect is a story-heavy third-person RPG, set in the future where humanity is spread across the galaxy, which is filled with all kinds of different alien species, and some have come together to form the Galactic Council, which oversee and control a majority of the galaxy. But there are civilizations that live outside the reach of the Council. The story centers around Commander Shepard, a character you create and play as for the trilogy. Shepard is sent to hunt down a rogue secret agent, and at the same time trying to make sense of an alien vision that you have at the start of the game. The story sends Shepard across the galaxy, travelling to different planets, completing quests, and gaining a variety of crewmates, both alien and human. Story-wise, Mass Effect 1 is arguably the weakest in the trilogy, but it's nowhere near bad. Mass Effect 2 and 3 focus heavily on the characters, while Mass Effect 1 is all about the world building, preparing you for the story that will take you across all 3 games, as well as setting up the characters and their storylines that will also cover across the 3 games. You can make many choices throughout the game that will have impacts on its sequels. Most choices are only small, in which they only get referenced in later games. Some choices create a storyline throughout all 3 games, and there are some huge impactful choices that can have huge consequences in the sequels. It's these choices that I think elevate Mass Effect from other games of this type. It gives the player a huge sense of agency. There is a morality system, giving you a choice between being a paragon of humanity, a soldier who goes out of their way to ensure the best outcome for everybody, somebody who would rather convince the enemy to stand down than go straight into a fight. Or you can be a renegade soldier, someone who would do whatever it takes to get the job done, regardless of civilian casualties. I have to say the renegade can get really silly sometimes. One problem I have with the system for Mass Effect 1 is that the choices you get for the most paragon or most renegade points end up with the same result. Do you reason with the enemy, or intimidate them? Either way, the same thing happens. There are, however, other choices you can make that would arguably get you more paragon or renegade results, but the devs don't give you as many points if you make these decisions. Here's an example. The true renegade response that gets you the most points for a hostage situation is to intimidate the terrorist into lowering their weapon, but you also have the choice to just open fire. I would say opening fire is the most renegade response, but you don't get as many renegade points for doing so, and you need to collect these points so you can level up your charm or intimidate skills in order to unlock the special dialogue options. When talking with characters, you usually get a choice between either a regular non-special paragon, neutral or renegade option. These options progress the conversation but don't get you the best outcome if there is a special option for charm or intimidate. You will also have the option to ask an ungodly amount of questions. Almost every conversation has an option to investigate, which gives you a bunch of questions to ask. This is really only used for world building, but it is appreciated. There are some problems I have with this system. First off, some of the options say the exact same thing, which just gives you an illusion of choice. These occasions are rare, and it's not noticeable on your first playthrough, but I find it strange who would do this. It seems to me to be a waste of time from a development point of view. Secondly, the dialogue has the same problem a lot of other games have. The options that are shown to you are just giving you an idea of what Shepard will say, so it can cause some confusion when you pick an option and Shepard will say something different, or in a tone you are not expecting. And finally, the dialogue wheel is set up so the top options are the paragon choices, the middle is neutral, and the bottom options are renegade. However, there are choices that break this layout. On one occasion I can think of, the top Paragon option is actually a Renegade choice, and there are many examples where the Renegade choice at the bottom is not the true Renegade response. Like the example I mentioned before, the true Renegade option for the hostage situation is to select a neutral option first, then you are given an option to intimidate. Let's get into the meat of the gameplay. Starting off with character creation. Shepard's gender, appearance, history and class can be customised to what the player wants. Depending on Shepard's gender, a few lines of dialogue will change. It will change who you can romance throughout the trilogy, and I should also mention that the female Shepard's voice actor Jennifer Hale gives a far better performance than the male voice actor Mark Meir. Male Shep gives a very robotic, bland performance throughout all 3 games, but in a weird way he's sort of become iconic. I mean, he's not terrible, he's just barely acceptable. I don't want to be too insulting, I'm certain voice acting is way harder than it seems. We can change Shepard's appearance, but the customization options are very limited. I also find it quite hard to make a Shepard that looks decent. They always look a little off when I'm done messing with the appearance. You can choose how Shepard grew up. Each choice has its own side quest attached to it, and will change some dialogue throughout the trilogy. Shepard's service history determines what kind of soldier Shepard was before the game begins. This only changes some dialogue later on, and unlocks some outcomes for some certain quests. And finally, we have Shepard's class. There are 3 ability groups to look at: combat, tech, and biotics. Combat abilities are designed to increase your character's health, defense, and damage output. Tech abilities are used to debuff enemies, remove their shields, or jam their weapons. And finally, we have biotics. Biotics are basically psychic powers. You have the ability to move enemies with your mind, lift them up in the air, or throw them across the room. You also have the most overpowered ability in the game, Singularity. This ability creates a black hole that lifts all enemies in the area into the air. This makes the hardest difficulty, Insanity, a breeze. Each class can use every weapon type, but they're only trained with certain ones. If you use a weapon that you're not trained with, then you cannot aim down sights. The weapon types are very basic: assault rifle, shotgun, pistol, and sniper rifle. Sure, they all shoot lasers, but if you replace them with bullets, then they're exact same as every other shooter set in the modern day. There are no creative sci-fi weapons, which is a huge shame. Even when you find new weapons, they're just a change in stats and appearance. They all feel the exact same. There is no ammo, instead you manage a heat gauge. Keep firing for a long time and you have to wait for it to cool down. This is really the only thing to consider when changing weapons or using attachments. You can equip a variety of add-ons to your weapons and armour. Again, there's not a lot of creativity here. Don't expect silencers or different scopes. Except for an attachment that stops your radar getting jammed, all of the attachments just give you a stat boost, make your weapon stronger against certain types of enemies, or adds a special effect to your ammo. Enemy AI is very annoying. Most of the time they just charge towards you, constantly spamming the same 3 lines over and over again. It can drive you mad. They have some very annoying abilities like immunity, which increases their damage resistance to the point they are almost invincible. Not only do the Krogan have this, which are basically tanks, but they can revive themselves once. It turns them into bullet sponges and they're just really annoying to fight. For the entire game you can take 2 squad mates with you, and each character has their own class and abilities that you can use. During a firefight, if you hold down a button to bring up the ability menu, you can command your squad to use their own abilities. As you kill enemies and complete quests, you'll gain XP and level up. Every level up will give you skill points, which you can use to power up and gain new abilities. Controlling Shepard is pretty bad. Shepard feels very heavy to control and movement feels stiff and awkward, both in combat and when you're just walking around. You can sprint, but it doesn't make a huge difference out of combat. If you're in combat and start sprinting, you just fly forward like a human bullet train. You can barely turn when sprinting, and that just adds to the awkwardness. Nothing shows off the janky controls like the Mako. It's been given the credit causing people to put down the game and never come back. You are pretty much forced to use it for every main mission, and if you want to do the side quests, then you'll need to use the Mako to travel around the planets. The problem with the Mako is that it's so incredibly floaty and bouncy, and it's just so annoying to control. For me, the worst part is not the Mako itself, it's the design of the planets that you land on. This only applies to these side planets. The main mission planets are basically just a road for you to drive down, but the side planets are a mess. They look like they were just automatically generated, and it makes them so goddamn frustrating to navigate. But however, here's the thing. I defend the Mako to the death. It's nowhere near bad enough to quit the game, and I find actually landing on planets and travelling around, no matter how awkward it is far better than the sequels where you just scan the planet. The game is actually pretty easy, especially if you use biotics. As I mentioned before, the biotic powers make the hardest difficulty a breeze. There are some noticeable difficulty spikes, but it's mainly dependent on what you do first. If you try doing the galaxy side missions first, then you may struggle a bit. The music is pretty good. It fits the sci-fi theme, which means it's all synth, and it has a few standout tracks that really nail like the chill vibe of space. The performance of the game on consoles is pretty awful. The game would often drop frames and fights would stutter and become incredibly distracting. On PC this was not an issue. In fact, the PC version had some graphics and UI upgrades, making it the best experience, as usual. The game is pretty buggy. There were times when the textures wouldn't load properly or animations would break. You can easily get stuck on the environment and stuck on other characters. Mass Effect 1 has two DLCs, Bring Down the Sky and Pinnacle Station. Bring Down the Sky is a mission where Shepard is called in to stop an asteroid that's been taken over by terrorists who are going to slam the asteroid into a human colony. It's only short, like maybe 1 hour to an hour and a half, but the story we get here is pretty decent. Bring Down the Sky, however, is Mako heavy, and although it doesn't feel as bad as the other side planets, the terrain still does feel automatically generated and it's not great. And we have Pinnacle Station, a DLC so bad that the devs didn't even bother to keep track of the files, meaning it only exists on the 360. Pinnacle Station unlocks an arena for you to fight in. We don't get much of a story here, it's just, hey Shepard, wanna fight in my VR arena? The DLC has a few modes for you to try. There's Time Trials, Survival, Capture the Point, and Hunt mode. Each mode you have to do 3 times, once on each map, and then you unlock a final survival mission. This DLC is garbage. The arena part of it is very basic, and the story attached to the arena could be summarised in one sentence. It's awful and you're not missing much if you skip this one. The game takes around 29 hours to complete. Mass Effect 1 is a classic. Despite its stiff gameplay and robotic animation, the story and the characters elevate this game above its flaws. I give Mass Effect 1 an 8 out of 10, and label it as a must play. Everyone should try this game at least once, as playing through this game, allowing the characters to be set up, makes watching them grow throughout the trilogy more satisfying and fun to experience. Now the Legendary Edition on Mass Effect 1 at times feels like a full remake. It's the highest amount of effort I've seen put into a remaster. The game now runs at 4K 60fps with HDR, and every aspect of the graphics have improved. Most noticeably is the lighting in the game. It's much brighter now, and that will help you appreciate the improved graphics even more.
This is difficult to fathom.
Some areas look like they've been completely remade, adding more detail to the terrain.
Really strange, like off the damn charts. It looks like it's coming from an under... Commander, I'm picking up some strange readings. Really strange, like off the damn charts.
The gameplay is no longer awkward. Shepard moves around much more fluidly, and all my complaints about the controls, except for the Mako, are now resolved. The Mako has been tweaked. It's not as floaty as before, but it still handles very awkwardly, and it always feels like you're driving on ice. You can now use any weapon with any class. However, the classes still have their skill trees to make them better with weapons that they would have used in the original. Sniping is now very satisfying. Beforehand, the sniper scope would sway back and forth, but now that's completely gone. You can also fire more shots before overloading your weapon. Combine that with the knockback that snipers have, and they become so overpowered it's silly. Different weapons will now have different fire rates, as opposed to just changing your stats. Some encounters have changed, making them better in my opinion. Fresher modes are now like mini boss battles themselves, as opposed to just mild annoyances. I played through the game on Insanity difficulty, and enemies would go from one-shot one-kills to bullet sponges all the time. I was starting to think different enemies have weaknesses or resistances to different types of weapons, but I couldn't confirm that. Textures are drastically improved, most noticeably on the planets you can land on. They have added grass and pebbles to the ground, as opposed to just a flat texture we had before. There is one huge flaw with the Legendary Edition, and that is the AI. It is far worse than the original. Enemies would sometimes just stand there while I shot them. They don't spam the same lines over and over again, but they still have other annoyances from the original. They will just rush you and use abilities that make them bullet sponges. The squadmate AI is also far worse. Most of the time they could not keep up with me. Sometimes I'll get stuck on stuff or completely crash. The game still has some bugs from the original. I even had one crash while playing. Even though it's not perfect, the Legendary Edition is superior. It still gets an 8 out of 10 due to the poor AI and its bugs, but it's a high effort remaster and it's a fantastic introduction to Mass Effect. Although it is overall better than the original, both the flaws that it carried over from the original and created itself keeps the game at an 8 out of 10. It's still a must play, and if I had to choose between the two, I would pick the Legendary Edition. Now for easily the best game in the trilogy, Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect 2 was released in 2010 for the Xbox 360 and PC, and then it was ported over to the PlayStation a year later. The game was released to huge critical praise and for good reason. The game is improved in every single way from the original. The gameplay is smoother, the story is focused on the characters instead of introducing you to the world, and the graphics are a huge step up. The story of Mass Effect 2 is very interesting. It is kind of a sidetrack from the overall story of the trilogy, but it's trying to set up the third game without giving away the punchline. The best part of Mass Effect 2 is the characters. Each crew member now has 2 story missions that you can play through, one to recruit them and another to gain their loyalty. Not only did these missions flesh out the characters, making them far more complex, charming and lovable than Mass Effect 1, the dialogue is far improved as well. Instead of your squad mates explaining the entire universe of Mass Effect to you, they're talking about themselves, what they think and feel about the mission, and any other stories that they trust to tell you. This brings the characters to life and they're such a joy to talk to. The Paragon/Renegade choices carry over from the first game, and you now have the ability to do interrupts. During a cutscene, a prompt may appear on the screen, giving you a chance to do a Paragon or Renegade response.
Or I'll run you in for vagrancy.
Are you two serious?
What?
You falsely accused this girl of stealing from you. All you have to say now is that she could have stolen it?
Now just a minute.
The gameplay is also improved. It no longer feels heavy and awkward to control Shepard. He/her moves much more smoothly. You now have limited ammo, but you don't have to worry about overheating your guns. I prefer this change. It means I have to cycle between my weapons when I run out of ammo. In Mass Effect 1, I could just use the same gun throughout the entire playthrough. Your weapons are limited to what your class can use, but now every weapon is different. They're not just different stats like before. There's also a new class of weapons you can use, the heavy weapons. They don't have a lot of ammo, but they do a ton of damage. Different classes of weapons have strengths and weaknesses against certain enemy types. Fast-firing weapons are good against biotics and energy shields, while slow-firing weapons do more damage against armor and health. The abilities you use look and feel more satisfying to use. Biotics have been nerfed and are no longer the overpowered room-clearing messes they were before. Abilities also have different strengths and weaknesses against different enemies, just like the weapons do. The Mako is now gone, so instead of landing on planets, you just scan them from orbit. You also need to mine planets in order to buy upgrades. The enemy AI is improved. There are a few enemies that charge you, but now they are rare. They also don't have annoying abilities, so battles now won't drag on longer than they should. There are now special enemies and mini-bosses, and honestly they kinda suck. The Scions and Praetorians especially just suck the fun out of the game whenever they appear. The soundtrack is really damn good. As well as the sci-fi sim theme, there are a few standout tracks, most noticeably the Suicide Mission track. It's so good. Performance-wise, the game does still have a few issues here and there, but it's not as bad as Mass Effect 1. The game is also far less buggy, but there's still a few. Mainly it's just animation jankiness. Mass Effect 2 has a lot of DLC. We have the Arrival DLC, Overlord DLC, Lair of the Shadow Broker DLC, Zaid the Mercenary, Kazumi's Stolen Memories, the Normandy Crash Site, and Firewalker. There's also a bunch of armor and weapon DLC, but the weapons honestly aren't that good. The armor looks cool, but you can't take the helmet off, and it makes them a bit distracting during conversations. The Firewalker DLC is basically a replacement for the Mako. There are a handful of missions designed for you to use the Hammerhead, a light hovercraft. It controls far better than the Mako. The only problem that I have with it is that the jump and boost meters are connected, so if you boost after jumping, the jump meter does not recharge. The Firewalker missions are not great. They are pretty much just basic maps with stuff for you to collect. The final mission for it is pretty interesting though. The Overlord DLC is fantastic. I'm not going to go into the story because it's one of the best stories in Mass Effect. Basically, a rogue virtual intelligence has taken over a station, and that's all I'm going to say for that. I highly recommend playing through Overlord. The Arrival DLC is also pretty good. It starts off with you saving a doctor from some terrorists, but that's only the start of the rabbit hole. I have a huge problem with this DLC. It's story critical. Mass Effect 3 starts off with the consequences of this DLC, and it will get referenced throughout that game. It makes it seem like the DLC was just cut off at the end and then sold back to us after release. At the very least, it should not have been sold separately if it's crucial to the plot. The Lair of the Shadow Broker is a huge DLC, in which you fight along a companion from Mass Effect 1 as you hunt down the biggest information broker in the galaxy. It's really good DLC, I highly recommend it. Saeed and Kazumi are DLC squad mates. Saeed is an old mercenary with a dark past. His DLC contains only his loyalty mission, so he doesn't get fleshed out as the other characters in the game. Kazumi also has one mission, but it's very long and very varied. The problem with these two DLC characters is that you can't talk to them back on the ship, or at the very least you can't have a conversation with them like you can with the other crew. They have items scattered around their room that when you interact with them, will cause them to talk about that particular item. You can interact with them and they'll say a line or two, but you can't actually talk to them. It really hurts their characters, since they're nowhere near as charming or as deep as the other squad mates. The Normandy crash site at the time of release was pretty good. You explore the crash site while collecting collectibles and having flashbacks. It doesn't have that much of an impact if you play the game one after the other, but I can see this having an impact on players if they waited between the releases when the game first came out. I do have one huge issue with all the DLC, and that's the fact that it has DRM on the Xbox 360 at least. For my videos I use different accounts to test my guides, but for Mass Effect 2 the DLC says it's corrupted, and that's a straight up lie since it works fine on the account the DLC was bought on. I did some further testing and found that the DLC also doesn't work when you're offline and won't allow you to load a save that has the DLC loaded. This is just fucking terrible. It's a single player game for Christ's sake. This DRM does not apply to the Legendary Edition. It's an all-in-one package, so it doesn't need to check its DLC. Mass Effect 1 did not have this problem. Any account could use the installed DLC. Overall, Mass Effect 2 is fantastic, easily the best in the trilogy. It gets a 10 out of 10. The gameplay, the characters, the story is just fantastic. The gameplay is a huge step up, and the only downside is the shitty DLC practices. I know a lot of people skipped Mass Effect 1 and just jump straight into 2. But when you don't get the setup for the characters, which gets explored in this game, and also a lot of the quests you do in Mass Effect 1 and choices you make have consequences in Mass Effect 2 and 3. So you end up missing out on those experiences if you skip Mass Effect 1. Mass Effect 2 takes around 35 hours to complete. For the Legendary Edition, Mass Effect 2 and 3 received far less attention than Mass Effect 1. Really, it's only a graphical change. There are 1 or 2 points where something has changed, but other than that, it feels like the original with a new coat of paint. Now for Mass Effect 3. Released in 2012, the game received mixed response. There was lots of controversy around this game at release, and the game still upsets a lot of people, including me, to this day. I'll get to the issues with this game later on. The best and worst part of Mass Effect 3 is its story. The events that have been foreshadowed and have been building up since the first game are now fully in effect for this entire game, and it's amazing. The stakes are huge, and the game keeps up this tense, dark atmosphere until the last half hour, where the story commits suicide. I would love to sit here and rant about the game's terrible ending, about how it's full of plot holes, and even just from its implementation, it's so against what Mass Effect was trying to accomplish. It feels like they ran out of time and money and just slapped an ending together out of paper mache and spit. But I'm not going to spoil anything, even if it's the most disappointing ending in modern video game history. But I will say the story right up until that last half hour is fantastic. It's on par with Mass Effect 2, well, except for the crappy dream sequences. They're thrown in every now and again and they suck ass. The characters were just as good as they were in Mass Effect 2, and now they will move around the ship and interact with each other. And it's so cool seeing these characters have charming conversations with each other. Mass Effect 3's gameplay is pretty much the exact same as Mass Effect 2, except now there are a ton of different weapons to choose from, and now every class can use any weapon. You can even add attachments to increase their stats, and some have unique benefits, like slowing down time for sniper rifles, or adding a thermal scope. The weapons are very creative, each firing differently, and having different effects, strengths and weaknesses. Heavy weapons have been removed from your inventory, and instead you can find them lying around on the ground during boss encounters. And there are now a lot of mini-bosses to fight. They are not as annoying as the Mass Effect 2 mini-bosses. The only one I have a problem with is the Banshee. It can instantly kill you if it gets close to you, and all it does is just teleport straight towards you. The controls feel a little more awkward than Mass Effect 2. However, I think that's more to do with the animations. The animations seem stiffer than they were before. Another example I can give for the awkwardness is the A button. The A button lets you sprint, dodge roll, interact with stuff, and take cover. The amount of times I tried to sprint or interact with something, and then just ended up dodge rolling got kind of annoying. The abilities are pretty much the same, but visually they have way more impact. I think they've changed them slightly to accommodate for the multiplayer. Doing galaxy quests have been dumbed down even further. Instead of scanning planets individually, you send out a ping while moving around the map. Any planets that have something for you to do will be highlighted then. Mining for resources has been removed. Now you just purchase upgrades with in-game money. The upgrades have also changed. In Mass Effect 2 they will give you buffs. Now you can just upgrade the stats of your weapons and equipment. Picking up side quests has also been dumbed down. For a lot of them you don't even need to interact with people. They will talk about their problems out loud and Shepard will just eavesdrop on them. And also dialogue options have also been dumbed down again. Now the majority of the time you only have 2 options to choose from, and you rarely get a chance to ask questions and expand upon what you're talking about. Let's get into the DLC where we have loads. We have a bunch of weapons and armour just like Mass Effect 2, and we have the Omega DLC, Citadel DLC, Leviathan DLC, and the controversial From Ashes. Let's start with From Ashes. This DLC rightfully got a ton of shit since it was day 1 DLC, and the content was actually on the disc. It's bullshit. It's such a terrible business practice, and thankfully EA/BioWare got a ton of shit for doing this. The content of the DLC includes 1 mission, and a new character similar to how Zahid and Kazumi were in Mass Effect 2. You can't talk to them on the ship just like with the others, but they have cutscenes every now and again, so they are fleshed out a bit better. The Omega DLC is a long mission where you retake the Omega Station, with Aria, who is a character from Mass Effect 2. I don't have much to say about this one. It's good, but it goes on for far too long in my opinion. Also, the original had some pretty funny bugs, but they have been fixed for the remaster.
Over now.
There we go.
You know what happens to people who argue.
It's like it like resets the actors once they've done their animation to their original point, and it's pretty funny to watch.
I have returned.
And I'm so ecstatic to meet you all as I spin on the spot, as I cannot control my own limbs.
Of the galaxy. You cannot be beaten, and you will never.
The Leviathan DLC is really good. You investigate the source of a mysterious mind-controlled murder, and that takes you on a journey, and it's just fantastic. And I saved the best for last, the Citadel DLC. This is hands down the best DLC in the trilogy. It's insanely long, adds a new section of the Citadel that's full of mini-games, but the best part is this DLC is basically just fan service. After you complete the mission that starts off this DLC, you hang out with all the characters from the trilogy, with fantastic writing and dialogue that celebrates every character we've fought alongside with. I cannot praise this DLC too much. It's worth playing through the trilogy just for this. However, there is one major flaw with the DLC, and that's 9 times out of 10 when you go to the new Citadel area, the game will crash. Mass Effect 3 also has the shitty DRM on its DLC, the exact same as Mass Effect 2. Other accounts on your Xbox cannot play the DLC, and if you're offline, you cannot load a save that has the DLC loaded. Again, it's truly fucking terrible. And again, this does not apply to the Legendary Edition. Mass Effect 3 also had multiplayer. This is not included in the Legendary Edition, which is a shame because I really enjoyed the multiplayer. If you've played Mass Effect Andromeda's multiplayer, it's pretty much the exact same, except it doesn't lag all the time. Multiplayer progression is based on collecting characters, weapons and equipment that you get from loot boxes. This is actually really terrible now I look back at it. You open loot boxes with in-game money that you get from completing matches, but of course you can just spend real money like a little cook. The matches were 4-player horde mode, and every now and again they would throw an objective for you to complete. I actually really enjoyed the multiplayer when people actually played it, and I would have played it again if it was included in the Legendary Edition. Mass Effect 3 is the longest in the series, taking around 50 hours to complete. Overall, Mass Effect 3 is amazing, right up until that last half an hour where it shits itself. I give the game an 8 out of 10. The 2 points I've taken off are just for the ending alone because it is that bad, it's awful. Legendary Edition again, just like Mass Effect 2, is mainly a graphics upgrade. There are 1 or 2 changes here and there, but overall it's pretty much the same as the original. I give Legendary Edition and the Mass Effect trilogy as a whole a 9 out of 10. It's a must play. Having all 3 games with all but 1 shitty DLC in one package is incredible to have, and I'm happy to see a bunch of newcomers be introduced to Mass Effect through this remaster. My next video will be an achievement guide on the Legendary Edition, but for now, thank you for watching and stay awesome.